of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Everybody seems to be here. Everybody white. The city auditorium is packed with sweating, jostling bodies. Two little blonde-haired boys try hard not to get stepped on as their mama, holding tight to their hands, steers them through the cheering crowd. A band is playing Dixie as the people clap their hands in time. And someone is waving a Confederate battle flag back and forth, back and forth. Sam and I stand together, understanding only a little of what is being said. The governor talks about a lot of things, but mostly he seems to be telling us that we are better than the Negroes. We had not known that we were better than anybody.
Here's a man of great talents, great skill, great charm, great everything. But it was all focused in the wrong direction, in the pursuit of power for the wrong reasons. That's the great tragedy of George Wallace.
How in the name of common sense can you be too strong about segregation? You either fought or you against it. They're not in the middle ground as I know of.
George Wallace caused a lot of suffering and a lot of misery, and I believe a lot of deaths.
I don't think the governor owes anyone an apology. How do you blame Governor Wallace, who stands with his traditions and customs and state and defies an entire national establishment? Maybe you can say the cause was wrong, but I think the man in many ways was right.
They've never paid any attention to anything that the people of your state and my state did or said in the past. They've called us rednecks. There sure are a lot of rednecks in this country.
To many, he was the embodiment of an American evil, segregation. To others, he was a defender of Southern pride and the working man, a politician willing to tell it like it is.
When has it come to have racial overtones in this country to stand for law and order?
He divided a nation.
Why don't you young folks get out of the auditorium?
And launched a conservative movement that transformed the country. But his story is more than that. It's the story of a young man trying to do right in a devil's bargain to achieve power. It's the story of a loving wife and a turbulent marriage that ends in tragedy. It's the story of an old man seeking forgiveness and redemption from the very people he had scorned. And it's the story of 5 bullets and what they took. A saga of America in the 20th century and the private journey of a man's soul. The life of George Wallace.
We now present Judge George C. Wallace.
During the next 4 years, many problems will arise in the matter of segregation and civil rights as a result of judicial decisions. Having served as judge of the 3rd Judicial Circuit of Alabama, I feel, my friends, that this judicial experience will be invaluable to me as your governor.
Judge George Wallace was the most liberal judge that I had ever practiced law in front of. He was the first judge in Alabama to call me mister in a courtroom. George Wallace said Mr. Chestnut, and I was almost shocked to hear that. It was so unusual.
And I want to tell the good people of this state, as a judge of the Third Judicial Circuit, if I didn't have what it took to treat a man fair, regardless of his color, then I don't have what it takes to be the governor of your great state.
In 1958, Judge George Wallace was an Alabama liberal running for governor. He tried to balance two ambitions, to help the poor and himself.
George Wallace was a very unusual individual. I think he was real human. He wanted to do for the downtrodden, but it became politically unpopular to do for the downtrodden if he was black.
George Corley Wallace understood poverty. He had seen it firsthand. He was born in 1919 in the small town of Clio in Barber County, Alabama. Though home to a privileged few, the county was overwhelmingly poor, its population almost evenly split between black and white. Wallace's parents were neither struggling sharecroppers nor of the plantation aristocracy. "We're not poor," his mother told him. "We have plenty to eat, and we have screen doors."
Wallace comes from not a well-to-do, but a respectable middle-class family. His grandfather was a doctor, well-respected, ran a drugstore, small landowner. But by the time George Wallace is born, the family, like so many in the South, has fallen on hard times. And so while Wallace wasn't part of the desperate poor, he was poor.
Accompanying his grandfather, the county doctor, on house calls, George got an intimate glimpse into the lives of his neighbors.
Many of the children, black and white, down in Barber County were delivered by Dr. Wallace, and there are many Wallace children down there named after the grandfather. But it bothered George to see people being without food, people who had to pay with a potato or a chicken. They just didn't have money out in the country. The Depression years made an indelible mark on his life. It was a very desperate time.
Despite the hard times, the Wallace family grew. George was followed by Gerald, then Jack, and 11 years later, Mary Ann. Their mother, Moselle, at one time an aspiring pianist, tempered the family's harsh pioneer-like existence with a pursuit of refinement, classical music, books, and every Sunday, a march to the Methodist church where she played hymns. George's father had a quick wit and a flair for conversation, but also a dark side, an explosive temper and a fondness for the bottle. He was a bad one for getting into fights, an acquaintance recalled. He'd fight them all.
His father was something of a ne'er-do-well who, despite his support from his father, simply wasn't able to make it. I think clearly Wallace he didn't want that to happen to him. He did not want to be perceived as a kind of failure. And in Barber County in the 1930s, there wasn't much of a way out of that place if you had ambition, except in politics.
Wallace's tiny county had produced 5 Alabama governors. Politics were sport, entertainment, a way of life.
My grandmother, his mother, would tell me stories about on Saturday, they would always find Daddy downtown at the center of the town where the courthouse was, or where people gathered and played checkers and that kind of thing, just shaking people's hands.
When he was a very young boy in Clio,
5 and 6 years old, and he would see someone new in Clio he had not seen, he would walk up to them as a 5 or 6-year-old and shake their hand and say, "Welcome to Clio. If I can do anything for you, let me know."
Just watching his father count votes in a local election was so exciting, Wallace later recalled. It was like watching someone water ski for the first time.
Wallace, from the time he was 13 years old, was obsessed, is not too strong a word, with the political process. He lived politics, he ate politics, he absorbed it. He was exhilarated by it. And he said, in fact, from the time that he got to the state capitol when he was 14 years old, he stood on the spot where Jefferson Davis had taken the oath of office as the first president of the Confederacy. And as he said, swore to himself, "I'm going to be governor someday."
Setting the woods on fire.
Another Wallace passion was boxing. By his late teens, he was a Golden Gloves champion, 2 years in a row.
There's a picture of my father that he took home after winning a bout, and he's throwing a good right hand, and the gentleman he hit in the nose has blood flowing from the punch, and it's just a perfect picture.
For many who knew Wallace, boxing would become a metaphor for his later combative political style. He always came out swinging. But Wallace would prove a cagier fighter outside the ring, carefully choosing his opponents, often waiting for their first move before throwing a devastating counterpunch. A brilliant and instinctive opportunist. Wallace graduated from the University of Alabama with a law degree in June 1942. A month later, with a friend, Glenn Curley, he met a clerk in a 5-and-dime store in Tuscaloosa. There she was, he said, olive-complexioned with auburn hair.
He said, "Well, I'm going to get a date with her." I said, "George, you know there's a law against contributing to the delinquency of a minor." I said, "What's her name?" He said, "I haven't met her yet." I said, "How do you know you're going to get a date?" He said, "We just wait and see." So he came back in a few minutes and said, "I got a date with her tonight." I said, "What's her name?" He said, "Lurleen Burns."
Well, I met my wife right after she'd finished high school when she was only 16 years of age. Of course, I didn't realize how young she was. She was very pretty, and there was just some little twist or sparkle about her.
George fell hard for the working-class girl, and she for him, but they shared few interests. Lurleen was known by family friends as a tomboy who enjoyed the outdoors. Politics, she later said, was something Daddy discussed. Despite their differences, by George's account, they were desperately in love and soon married. By the end of 1944, they had their first child, Bobby Joe, and scraped by, living in a converted chicken coop near a military base in New Mexico. With World War II raging overseas, George had entered the Army Air Corps, but turned down officer candidate school. After the war, he reasoned, there'd be more enlisted men voting than officers. In 1946, 27-year-old George Wallace won his first election as state representative for Barber County. An observer commented, "Hell, George knew every voter down to the chicken thieves." The new legislator was a whirlwind of energy. In his first year, he introduced over 50 bills, many of them programs for the poor, paid for by new taxes on the rich.
He had a reputation as something of a, quote, socialist. He sponsored all of this legislation that would bring industry to the state and that sort of thing. But mainly he was identified with the Jim Folsom wing of politics, the very progressive, liberal faction of Alabama politics.
Big Jim Folsom, a twice-elected governor, dominated the post-war politics of Alabama. no politician would influence Wallace more. And Big Jim was living proof that progressive politics could lead to the governorship.
To Big Jim Folsom, politics was about economic power, to represent poor and struggling working class and even middle class people against elites, against the forces of economic power that he felt like were constantly trying to keep them down.
I went to one of his rallies. He had the song, "Y'all come, y'all come." When you say y'all come, that means that didn't say Negro nor white. He said, y'all come.
If you're living in the country, everybody is your neighbor. On this one thing you can rely. They will all come to see you and never ever leave you saying, y'all come to see us by and by. Y'all come.
Folsom's "Y'all Come" reflected his steadfast resistance to the siren call of racism.
I think he wanted to make adjustments. He was one of the officials that I think were not rabid. He was not a rabid segregationist. He was not a hater.
To Big Jim, the poor were the poor, regardless of color, a view the young George Wallace seemed to share.
The one thing that Wallace asked Folsom for directly was an appointment to the Tuskegee Board of Trustees, the state's most prestigious black college university.
Unheard of that a white man from Alabama, from Barber County, South Alabama, would want to be on that board. And I think that was the real George Wallace.
Folsom once said that he thought that Wallace was just a little too far ahead of his time, that he really believed that Wallace was already thinking about the time in the future when blacks would be voting in Alabama, and he wanted to be there on the ground floor.
Y'all come, oh, y'all come to see Jim now and then.
In 1952, Wallace won election as an Alabama circuit judge. The populism he practiced from the bench impressed even those who would one day become his fiercest opponents.
Wallace was for the underdog. I was representing some poor black farmers. They had been stripped of their cotton by a major cotton oil processor in Birmingham. And they sent down these high-priced lawyers and all that, and Wallace was sitting there looking at them, and I was sitting over at another table with my little clients in overalls and all of that. And these people looked down on us, these lawyers did. They would even refer to us as plaintiffs. They just said those people with a good deal of scorn. And you could see Wallace getting tense over that and giving them the eye. And finally, he said to them, when you address Mr. Chestnut from now on, you will address him as Mr. Chestnut. You will refer to his clients as the plaintiffs. Do you understand? And they understood. And Wallace ruled against them and ruled for me in every case. If I was asking for $100, I got $150. He was sitting without a jury. So Wallace was quite different from the rest of the judges in Alabama.
At age 14, George Wallace had vowed to someday become governor. In 1958, at age 39, he made his move. But he now faced a new political force, one that would pit his compassion for the poor against his hunger for power. The arrest 3 years earlier of Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white man had grown into a Negro boycott of the city's segregated buses and had given rise to a mass movement for civil rights led by a young minister named Martin Luther King, Jr. The protests left white Alabamians feeling under siege. In his campaign, Wallace tried to find some middle ground. Though he supported segregation, his moderate positions gained the endorsement of the civil rights organization, the NAACP.
Even when Wallace adopts a segregationist position, as he does very strongly in the mid-1950s, he still somehow feels that he can be a moderate segregationist. He tries to run as a responsible segregationist. He speaks against the Klan, for example. And he tries to continue the same themes that have carried Folsom to victory.
Wallace's opponent had other ideas. John Patterson, the state's Attorney General, had used the courts to drive civil rights activists out of Alabama. He approved of the death sentence for a black man convicted of stealing $1.95 from a white woman. And Patterson left no doubt where he stood on integration.
Once you let the bar down, it's all over. And I'm not for token integration or any kind of integration. And I think that some of the people in the state who've been advocating token integration have already sold us out before the fight even starts.
John Patterson was my cousin. My mother was a Patterson. And John Patterson's father was a very fine man. And John Patterson, I think, perfectly intelligent person, but he ran for governor on the worst racist platform you have ever seen in your life. It's just as racist as you can possibly be.
Just before the election, a newspaper exposed close connections between Patterson's campaign and the Ku Klux Klan. In the past, that alliance would have cost a candidate the votes of moderates. But in Alabama in 1958, the middle ground had disappeared.
And I want to tell the good people of this state, as a judge of the 3rd Judicial Circuit, if I didn't have what it took to treat a man fair, regardless of his color, then I don't have what it takes to be the governor of your great state.
The final runoff wasn't even close. Patterson was swept to victory. Wallace was devastated, his lifelong dreams shattered.
It's one of the few times in Wallace's career that he didn't really understand what the people were thinking. He knew segregation was an issue, but he did not realize that it was the tough, mean issue that it was in 1958.
1958 was a turning point for George Wallace. The defeat would change him, the future of Alabama, and the political landscape of the entire country.
George Wallace, with his keen political antenna, understood immediately why he had lost. And I think he decided at that point that he would exploit race to the extent it took necessary, that he considered it necessary to win.
And in doing that, he made a Faustian bargain. The one-time progressive decided to sell his soul for the governorship, and he could never turn back on that fully.
George Wallace came back to the district after the defeat, back to our county, and he asked me would I come over to his office and talk with him. So I did, and he said, "Seymour, you know why I lost that governor's race?" I said, "I'm not sure, Judge. What do you think?" He said, "Seymour, I was out-niggered by John Patterson, and I'll tell you here and now, I will never be out-niggered again."